All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to take a look at Parashat Tzav this week. And if you're following along in the Etz Chaim Chumash, it's on page 613. So it's a nice auspicious number to begin our conversation. And it begins, appropriately enough, considering the page number. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons thus." So this is where we get the name of the parsha. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. You can't name a parsha any of that because that starts dozens of sentences in the Torah. Tzav et Aharon et banav lemor. Command Aaron and his sons, saying. So God is passing a message to Moses. Moses is then in turn supposed to pass the message to Aaron. And this is the message. It is about the rituals in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and presumably in the temple in the future. This is the ritual of the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself shall remain where it is burned upon the altar all night until morning, while the fire of the altar is kept going on it. The priest shall dress in linen raiment, with linen breeches next to his body. He shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar, and place them beside the altar. He shall then take off his vestments, and put on other vestments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a pure place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning, not to go out. Every morning the priest shall feed wood to it, lay out the burnt offering on it, and turn into smoke the fat parts of the offerings of well-being. A perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar, not to go out. So this is describing a couple of different things. One is about what to do with the burnt offering, specifically what to do, how to burn it, how to keep it burning, what to do with it after the burning has concluded, after it has been reduced to ashes. So after it's been reduced to ashes, what do you do with the ashes? So that's one concern. And then the other one is about not about the offerings, but about the altar itself. What do you do with the altar? How is this supposed to work? And there is a great amount of concern here that the fire on the altar continue to burn. We're told in a couple places in this paragraph that the fire shall be kept burning. It should not go out. A perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar, not to go out. So you could imagine a scenario where you light the altar in the morning, you do the sacrifices, you let it burn into the evening, and it's sort of like a fireplace. You let the embers smolder, and overnight they go out. Not a big deal. You just light it again in the morning. But the text here is insistent that not be the case, that you should not let it go out. And this introduces a bit of a problem when you have this text and you have to line it up to another text in our Torah. This is, in many ways, one of the sort of major projects of Rabbinic Judaism. When you have two verses that seem at odds with each other, how do you reconcile them? And here we have two verses, or we have a verse here and a verse elsewhere in Exodus that are clearly at odds with each other. Because we are told here not to let the fire go out and to kindle it every morning, to add more wood every morning. And then we're also told on Shabbat we're not supposed to put, and we're not supposed to start a fire, we're not supposed to add to a fire, we're not supposed to put out a fire. This is the very literal reading from the book of Exodus. In a couple of different places that you should not light a fire on Shabbat. And this is, of course, one of the 39 melachot, one of the 39 categories of forbidden labor on Shabbat is to start a fire. And so how do you reconcile this? Well, the rabbis reconcile it by saying, essentially, that when you are commanded to do something by God, that commandment sort of forms its own protective bubble, for lack of a better term. And so the commandment to keep the fire burning in the temple is specific and overrides the more general commandment not to light a fire on Shabbat. And so there was no, in this sense, in the sense of fire, there was no Shabbat in the temple. There was no Shabbat observance in the temple. Now, Shabbat was observed in other ways, but the restrictions of Shabbat do not apply in the temple because they couldn't, because we need to keep this fire burning. We see this in other places, by the way. If you were to go back in time a couple thousand years on Rosh Hashanah, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, you might know, we do not blow the shofar. This goes back to a concern about carrying the shofar on Shabbat, that someone who doesn't live in an eruv, they might feel the need to do this mitzvah, and so they would carry the shofar to the synagogue or carry it to wherever they're going, and they would violate Shabbat by carrying something, by what we call hotzah mereshut lereshut, moving from one domain to another. This is, you could say it's not a concern in the temple because there's an eruv, but that's not actually the way the text is usually understood. They say it's not a concern because that prohibition of Shabbat just simply doesn't apply in the temple itself. That aspect of Shabbat doesn't apply. And we see this other places as well, where we're sort of given a general rule and a more specific rule, and the specific rule often comes to carve out an exception in the general rule. So, for instance, we're told not to harm ourselves. This is a sort of classic rabbinic understanding of the statement in the book of Deuteronomy that you shall live by God's commandments. This is understood to be an imprecation against doing something dangerous, against doing something harmful. And so it's a basic premise that you are not allowed to take a knife and cut one of your body parts off. This is probably most people don't want to do this anyway, but even if you did want to do this, you are forbidden in the Torah to just cut your finger off or something like that. And yet we are commanded to cut a body part off. We are commanded to circumcise our sons on the 8th day. And so the rabbis say, had it not been commanded, it would be forbidden. Now this has implications for when a non-Jew wants to be circumcised. Sometimes someone who's not Jewish, they will approach the rabbi, the moel. They say, you're the best at this. Can you do this for our family? And strictly speaking, the answer probably ought to be no. Outside of commandedness, there should not be circumcision unless it could be proven that it was for some medical benefit, which is a controversial topic, I know. But I only bring this up to point out that there are other places in our tradition where a specific commandment to do something overrides a more general commandment not to do something, just like here, where we have to light a fire every day, including on Shabbat. All right, any questions about that? Thoughts, concerns? All right, we'll keep going. We're on verse 7. This is the ritual of the grain offering. The word for grain offering in Hebrew, if you take a look here, is hamincha. So mincha, grain offering, just like mincha, the afternoon service. So there's a pretty literal connection between those two. Aaron's sons shall present it before the Lord in front of the altar. A handful of choice flour and oil of the grain offering shall be taken from it, with all the frankincense that is on the grain offering, and this token portion shall be turned into smoke on the altar as a pleasing odor to the Lord. What is left of it shall be eaten by Aaron and his sons. It shall be eaten as unleavened cakes in the sacred precinct. They shall eat it in the enclosure of the tent of meeting. It shall not be baked with leaven. I have given it as their portion from my gifts. It is most holy, like the purification offering and the reparation offering. Only the males among Aaron's descendants may eat of it, as their due for all time throughout the ages from the Lord's gifts. Anything that touches these shall become holy. All right, so there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially what's going on here is we're looking at this ritual of the grain offering. And by the way, the word that they're translating here is ritual. If you look in the Hebrew, is Torah. It says Vazot Torat HaMincha. So literally, this is the Torah of the Mincha. This is the teaching of the grain offering. Nothing wrong with ritual as a translation. It's a fine enough. It gets the point across, I think. But it doesn't really drive home the fullness of the Hebrew. So people are bringing a grain offering, and a tiny portion of it is being destroyed, is being burnt as a symbolic offering to God. So a small portion of it is burnt on the altar, just like you would burn an animal sacrifice. And what is left becomes the bread for the Kohanim. If you remember, the Kohanim, the Leviim, they do not have tribal holdings in Israel. They don't have a piece of territory of their own. They do have some small cities that are designated as Levitical cities, but even at that, the farmland described around the Levitical cities is fairly small, and the Kohanim and Leviim are at times even included in the list of poor people that you should not discriminate against. So it'll say, the widow and the orphan and the stranger and the Levite. And so we see in that grouping that some of the Leviim, some of the Kohanim were probably quite poor. They didn't have farms, they didn't have land of their own, and they had no way to feed themselves except through the rituals of the tabernacle and the temple, where people would bring them offerings, and they would be brought on behalf of this ritual for God, and a tiny portion of it would be burned, and most of it, the bulk of it, would be eaten by the Levites, and this was how they fed themselves. This is how they took care of themselves and their families. All right, as we continue on here, we see that when they are using the grain offering, when they're eating the grain offering, it is cooked as matzah. It is cooked as unleavened cake. It says, in the sacred precinct they shall eat it. So they can't just take it wherever they go. They have to eat it. They have to cook it in the area around the altar, the area around the tabernacle or the temple. It says, in the enclosure, the tent of meeting. And there seems to be, I think it's implied by the connection between the verses here, there seems to be a connection between the unleavened nature of the bread and the holiness of the bread. I mean, we see this around Passover. We unfortunately we don't have these sort of restrictions in the rest of the day, the rest of the year. But around the time of Passover, it's pretty common to have sort of a conversation about the deeper meaning of chametz, the deeper meaning of leavening. and what it is that we are trying to destroy when we temporarily cease to eat leavened bread and even have it in our homes. And people will sometimes speak about the sort of puffed up nature, the arrogant nature of a puffy bread. And so we see here that the temple precinct, under ordinary circumstances, was kosher for Passover year round. There was not leavened bread being made in the temple or in the tabernacle. There is one exception to that, which is that at Shavuot, part of the ritual of Shavuot was to bake leavened bread in the temple. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. We could spend a lot of time getting into that. That's a lot of very very powerful Torah on Shavuot, and Shavuot's not all that far away. So maybe we'll save that for another time. The text goes on. Only the males among Aaron's descendants may eat of it, as their due for all time throughout the ages from the Lord's gifts. So this actually stands in contrast to the meat that Aaron and the Kohanim bring home from work, where they are offering the sacrificial animals, and we've talked about this before. Depending on the type of offering, occasionally they will be entirely destroyed. They'll be entirely burned up. Most of the time, what would end up happening is people would bring an offering, the priests would sacrifice it, they'd slaughter it, they'd remove some section of it and burn it for God. Usually what they were burning was things you wouldn't really want to eat anyway. And then another small section of it was taken for the priests, sort of compensation for doing the sacrifice. And then the bulk of the animal, the bulk of the meat, was returned to the person who had brought the sacrifice. But we see with that meat that the Kohanim are allowed to take that home. They're allowed to bring it home. They're allowed to offer it to their families, to their wives, to their children, male and female. And so part of the discussion in the Talmud is who is eligible to eat the truma, the sacred meat. What if someone is the daughter of a Kohen, but she married someone who's not a Kohen? Well, then they say, since she's married to someone who's not a Kohen, she's no longer eligible to eat the truma. Okay. Well, what if he dies and she goes back home to live with her parents? You can sort of get into all the different permutations, all the different complications, and the rabbis certainly do that. But we see here it's even stricter for this this matzah that's being made here. Only the males among Aaron's descendants may eat it. So presumably they would sort of, they'd nosh on this during their work hours, and it wasn't the sort of thing that you would take home with you. All right. Any thoughts about this, or questions, concerns, clarifications?
I had a thought about it. It's very interesting to me that the Kohanim, you always assume, were extremely powerful, and you hear about various disagreements between different families of Kohanim, but did it always remain the case that Kohanim didn't have much in the way of land or goods, and that is that typical of other societies? Because it seems to be a balance, a checking of power type thing between the clergy and the rest of the folks. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we don't have as much information on that question as we would like. Is kind of the short answer. We have the biblical text, and we have some, midrashim and writings of Josephus and this sort of thing. And so we get sort of glimpses in time of different situations. It would seem that in biblical Israel, if you remember, in biblical Israel, there were these high places scattered up and down the country, and the biblical author, or at least the author of the book of Kings, hates the fact that these high places exist everywhere, and that's part of Josiah's reforms, is to tear down the high places. Well, probably every high place sort of was its own temple and had its own local priests. So every valley and every region would have its own priest, its own kohanim, and when they would do okay, but when Josiah centralizes the worship of God in the one temple in Jerusalem, that ends up shutting out a vast number of priests and Levites who lived in other towns. And many of them sort of come to Jerusalem, and they become, sort of minor priests, second fiddles, because the Jerusalem priests, they were not interested in opening it up. They were not interested in opening these categories. So we actually see this. If we had more time to get into this, this is one of the interesting moments going on in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is described as being a priest from the village of Anatot, who spends most of his life in Jerusalem. So probably he was one of these. His family was one of these people who were who lost their job when the Bamot were closed down and worship was centralized. Later on, by the time you get to the Second Temple of the Roman era, the priestly families were sort of there was no one priestly family that was permanently in charge. They were all sort of fighting for their privileges, and the Romans were playing them off each other. But the temple in Jerusalem had acquired enormous sums of wealth, including a lot of land. So by the time you get to the end of the temple period, the priests they're doing pretty well for themselves.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
That was a good summary.
It's a fascinating subject. Like I say, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we kind of have to read between the lines, but it is really, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. You can read in the book of Judges. There's this incident where the tribe of Dan, they feel like they're getting too far away from the other worship sites, and they need to start one of their own, and so they get someone to be a priest for them, and they kind of kidnap him and force him to be a priest, and it's a very strange and fascinating story. This is the story you may be familiar with, where he is described as being the grandson of Menashe, but if you look at the way the text is written, the nun sort of hangs over the other letters of the word, and it looks like it was inserted by a scribe who was uncomfortable with the fact that this priest was in fact the grandson of Moshe, and so he changed it to Menashe. But this is probably the fate of the family of Moses. All right. We will keep going here. We're going to turn the page, beginning on verse 17. It says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons thus." This is the ritual of the purification offering. Did I skip something? I did skip something. Tell you what. So we'll go back to verse 12. We'll take a look here on verse 12. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This is the offering that Aaron and his sons shall offer to the Lord on the occasion of his anointment. 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour as a regular grain offering, half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. shall be prepared with oil on a griddle. You shall bring it well soaked, and offer it as a grain offering of baked slices of pleasing odor to the Lord. And so shall the priest, anointed from among his sons to succeed him, prepare it. It is the Lord's, a law for all time, to be turned entirely into smoke. So too every grain offering of a priest shall be a whole offering. It shall not be eaten. So just a couple of things to point out here. So one is that most of the time, the priests are the, for lack of a better word, the middlemen. They're the agents. They're the ones who are facilitating an offering brought by someone else. But we do see moments where the priests are doing their own offering, where they are the ones bringing the sacrifice. Not just for the ritual purposes, but they're the one who's called to bring it. And so this is one of those moments at the anointing of the priests and the high priest. They bring a tenth of an ephah of flour. And so you can sort of ask the question, where did this come from? The priests who aren't farmers, who don't, at least initially, don't own all that much land themselves, where are they getting their sacrifices? Where are they getting their offerings? And in this case, it's entirely possible that that the priest buys the flour. But you can also read this to say that this is the priests receive flour as part of their part of their payment, part of their compensation for other people's offerings, other people's sacrifices, and you could save some and bring it on your own behalf here. And we see that in the way tithing works. When a farmer needs to offer a tithe of his or her produce to the Levites, the farmer gives 10%, and the Levites receive that 10%, and then the Levites themselves are required to give 10% of that to the Kohanim. So the Kohanim end up with, I guess that'd be 1% of the farmer's original field. But the Levites, even though they have received a sacred offering, they themselves become required to offer some portion of it. And so, in this moment, Aaron offers this symbolic amount of flour. But unlike when a regular person brings a grain offering and some small portion of it is burned and the rest is eaten by the priests, here it's entirely burned, and it's pretty reasonable why you would say that. If I bring an offering and then I get to eat it, that's not really an offering. I didn't really sacrifice anything. When we burn a tiny bit of it and then I get almost all of it back, that's not really a sacrifice. And so here, for the anointment of the priest, you see it is entirely burned, entirely turned to smoke. Nothing shall be eaten. All right, we'll continue on verse 17. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons thus: This is the ritual of the purification offering. The purification offering shall be slaughtered before the Lord at the spot where the burnt offering is slaughtered. It is most holy. The priest who offers it as a purification offering shall eat of it. It shall be eaten in the sacred precinct, in the enclosure of the tent of meeting. Anything that touches its flesh shall become holy, and if any of its blood is spattered upon a garment, you shall wash the bespattered part in the sacred precinct. An earthen vessel in which it was boiled shall be broken. If it was boiled in a copper vessel, the vessel shall be scoured and rinsed with water. Only the males in the priestly line may eat of it. It is most holy. But no purification offering may be eaten from which any blood is brought into the tent of meeting for expiation in the sanctuary, any such shall be consumed by fire. All right, so jumping back over to the Hebrew side on verse 17 and 18, what is being translated here as purification offering, in Hebrew we call this a chatat, and the chatat is a sort of basic. It's one of the sort of building blocks of the temple system, of the sacrificial system. This is one that the rabbis end up spending a lot of time talking about. So a Nazir, a Nazirite, at the end of his or her vow, brings a chatat. A pregnant woman, after giving birth, brings a chatat. And there are, the way the rabbis understand the Torah text. Basically, anytime you see a transgression for which the penalty is death, the way the rabbis understand that is that death is the penalty for people who do this thing intentionally, and they do it having been notified ahead of time not to do it, and they do it for the purpose of going against the will of God. So let's say I'm gonna break Shabbat, right? I'm gonna break Shabbat, and you might crack open the Torah and say, "Oh, don't do it, Mike. The penalty is death." That seems pretty extreme, right? And it is pretty extreme. But the only time the rabbis say the penalty is death is if I said, "Hey, I'm going to break Shabbat because I don't care about keeping Shabbat or the Torah or God or any of this nonsense." And you warn me, you say, "Mike, don't do it. The penalty is death." And I say, "I don't care. I am going to do it." And then I break Shabbat. Oh, and there have to be 2 witnesses who watch me do it also. So then it's death. But if I wake up in the morning and I say, "Oh, what a beautiful Sunday morning," and I start cooking my breakfast, and then I realize it's not Sunday morning, it's Saturday morning. Oh no! And I did it by mistake. Then I offer a chatat. So the chatat is sort of the building block of much of what we discuss in the Talmud. And this is it. This is the description of the ritual of the chatat, of what they translate here, the purification offering. You'll sometimes see it translated as sin offering. That's a pretty good translation. Sometimes in the English-speaking world, sometimes you'll hear Jews who get kind of worked up about the word sin. Sin's not a particularly good English word to describe anything in Hebrew. I've heard many people say that. I personally don't buy it. I think that when we speak about sin in English, there is some overlay of Christian concepts because English has been spoken mostly by Christians for 1,000 years. I think there's no getting around that. But this is going to be true of any word in English. Any word in English is liable to be loaded with Christian assumptions because that's the history of our language. But there is such a thing as sin in Judaism. There is such a thing as actions you shouldn't do that have spiritual consequences. And the word is chet, is one of the words. For this is chet, and chet and chatat, they obviously do have a connection to each other. So sin offering, purification offering, I think both of those are fine. So we see here with this chatat that it is another one that can be eaten, but only in the sacred precinct. And there's a whole ritual here for the blood. The blood of the chatat is holy in its own way and needs to be disposed of in the correct manner. So You can't take any of the meat of the chatat home with you. And I think the implication here is you can't take any of the blood home with you, even on your clothing, even if there was just a little accident and you got a little of the blood of the chatat on you. The chatat needs to stay in the temple precinct, in the area around the altar. And so, if you get a little chatat blood on you, your clothing needs to be cleaned. And they describe here a couple of possibilities. One is that if you boil your clothing in a copper vessel, that the copper vessel then needs to be scoured and rinsed in water. And if you do it in an earthen vessel, the earthen vessel has no way of being purified and must simply be smashed up and destroyed. This is one of the places where we derive certain rules about kashrut as it relates to our cooking vessels, as it relates to our pots and pans, and we see in the Torah there are various places where this is mentioned, that there are ways to clean certain materials, and there are other materials that simply cannot be cleaned under any circumstance. And so copper, a metal pot can be rinsed cleaned and rinsed in water, and the earthenware, there is no way to clean it, and so it just needs to be destroyed. And so that's true of the chatat, and it's also true of, you accidentally mix meat and milk, or you I don't know how you would accidentally cook a piece of bacon. There'd be a number of circumstances that would lead you to an accident like this, but I guess it could happen. It's the same basic principle. All right, any questions about this, or thoughts, concerns? All right, so we will keep going here. So as we keep going, you might notice that the language gets a little more sparse. The language, it leaves out a number of things, and the things that it's leaving out tend to be things that we were already told in a previous section. So the text doesn't repeat every single time, here's how you slaughter it, and here's what you do with the blood, and here's how you burn it, and here's what you do with the ashes. It doesn't say that for every single one of these sacrifices, and the implication is that this text is only bringing you the details that change. And so if you don't see it here, it's probably because you do it the same way as was described in the previous section. All right, so we'll keep going here. We're beginning chapter 7. So this is the ritual of the reparation offering. It is most holy. The reparation offering shall be slaughtered at the spot where the burnt offering is slaughtered, and the blood shall be dashed on all sides of the altar. Its fat shall be offered, the broad tail, the fat that covers the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them at the loins, and the protuberance on the liver, which shall be removed with the kidneys. The priest shall turn them into smoke on the altar as a gift to the Lord. It is a reparation offering. Only males in the priestly line may eat of it. It shall be eaten in the sacred precinct. It is most holy. The reparation offering is like the purification offering. The same rule applies to both. It shall belong to the priest who makes expiation thereby. So too the priest who offers a man's burnt offering shall keep the skin of the burnt offering that he offered. Further, any grain offering that is baked in an oven, and any that is prepared in a pan or on a griddle, shall belong to the priest who offers it. But every other grain offering, with oil mixed in or dry, shall go to the sons of Aaron, all alike. All right, so we've got another category of offering here. We have we were looking at the chatat, and now we are looking at the asham. And if all you had was this text in front of you, it's a little unclear what the difference is. It's a little unclear why you bring one and not the other. And so this is something the rabbis spend a lot of time getting into, is why exactly a person brings a chatat, why exactly a person brings an asham. In both cases, though, it would take too long to get really into it. But in both cases, this is about a sort of model of repentance, a model of forgiveness. And we talked about this last week, but I do really, again, want to emphasize that everything that's going on here is it's a series of rituals that are meant to reflect an inner reality. And so if all you had in front of you was this text, you would be fairly safe in concluding, when I have committed a sin, when I have committed a transgression, when I have become ritually impure, unclean, there is a ritual I can do in the temple that takes care of that cleans me up. And I mean, from a scholarly point of view, it might even be that is actually what the author of Leviticus is trying to tell you. That the author of Leviticus is saying that these temple rituals are very effective. They do what they need to do, and they work for you, and they work for me, and aren't they wonderful? Most of the biblical authors, most of the biblical texts, don't really have a lot of regard for that point of view, where you can commit some sort of transgression and then just do a ritual and then you're fine. Just bring a goat, bring a sheep, and then you're fine. Most of the biblical texts, including other places in the Torah and all of the prophets, almost without exception, they say that the sacrificial system is it doesn't do anything. It does not cause you to be forgiven. What causes you to be forgiven is your repentance. What causes you to be forgiven is when you regret what you've done and you try to make amends, and you dedicate yourself to not doing it again. And so that is what brings forgiveness from God. The rituals of the temple point to that. They point to tshuva, and they remind you of the necessity of tshuva. Now, I can't tell you that everyone has always thought that, and I can't tell you that the author of this text thinks that. But this is the overwhelming consensus of the Jewish thinkers, Jewish writers, going back to biblical times. You know, in whether it's in Hosea or Amos or the psalmist writing in the name of David, they all agree God doesn't actually care about getting sacrifices. And this stands in contrast, by the way, to other religions of the ancient world. This is a bit of a digression, but it's important to emphasize this. So, if you've ever taken a world literature class, you might have read the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a fascinating book, and at one point Gilgamesh meets the man who survived the global flood. It's a version of Noah's Ark that is probably older than our Noah's Ark story, and it's about a man who survived the global flood. He built a box and he put all the animals in it, and he and his family survived, and it's a very reminiscent story. And in this version of the story, the world is flooded for a year, and when the floodwaters go down, and this man can step onto dry land again, the first thing he does is builds an altar and he offers a sacrifice to the gods. And the text says the gods descend like flies. The gods are hungry. It's been more than a year since they had a sacrifice from human beings, and they are famished. And so this was the common way of thinking about sacrifice. The sacrifice was a way to please the gods. It was a way to get something from the gods. It was and the gods needed it as much as we needed it. There's an economy to animal sacrifice where the gods are hungry. The gods can't feed themselves. They need us to feed them. And it's notable that as much as we talk about sacrifice in the Torah, we don't actually share that point of view. We don't share that theology. And at no point in the Torah or in the Tanakh as a whole is God ever referred to as eating the sacrifice. The closest we get to that is that God enjoys the smell. Just like I might enjoy the smell if I'm walking through the park and someone's having a barbecue, or maybe I walk by a bakery and I enjoy the smell. But enjoying the smell is very different from eating the food. It's very different from being satisfied with a meal. And God does not require satisfaction. God doesn't need to eat a meal. God doesn't need the sacrifice. And so everything that's going on here, it might look very similar to the ways of the nations of the world, or at least what they used to do back then. But it speaks to a completely different theology. The sacrificial system in the Torah is a reminder of the relationship that God wants to have with us. And it's a reminder of the fact that we often impair that relationship. We often do things that we shouldn't do, and it causes harm to our relationship. It causes harm to our metaphorical marriage with God. And so we need to repair that sometimes. We need to do the work to rebuild the relationship. And the sacrificial system is simply a reminder of the work that needs to be done. It's not the thing that does the work itself. All right, so let's jump into the text here, because that was sort of a fun digression. But let's get back into the text itself. So we see in this Asham a description of all of the pieces of the animal that are burned on the altar. And the word here is fat or chelev, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, those who were there for our Torah study on Shabbat. That fat, chelev, in the Torah doesn't mean every single piece of fat. If you're eating a piece of steak and it's got a little bit of fat on it, you shouldn't ever look at that and be concerned like, oh, it says in the Torah not to eat the fat. That's not the fat it's talking about. The fat it's talking about is usually what we call in English suet, and it's big pieces of fat, enormous pieces of fat that surround the organs of a cow or a sheep or a goat. And so the suet here is being removed, along with the entrails and the kidneys and the protuberance of the liver. So by and large, things that you're not necessarily inclined to eat anyway. I know some people do eat kidney, some people do eat entrails, they eat intestines. My assumption is that no one prefers that over a steak. I think most people, given the choice, don't want to eat these bits, and so that's what ends up getting destroyed. That's what ends up getting turned into smoke, and the rest of it can be eaten by the priests, by the males of the priestly line, and again only in the sacred precinct. So they cannot take it home. And then we sort of conclude this section with it's kind of it feels almost like an insert. It feels almost like oh yeah, there's some things we should have mentioned before and we forgot, and so now we're we're going to jump back in. I'm not saying that's how the text got from its author's pen to where it is today, but it's entirely possible. I mean, it reads like that, where we say, oh, the same rules apply to the reparation offering as the purification offering. And also, the priest who offers a man's burnt offering shall keep the skin of the burnt offering. So this feels like, oh, maybe we should have mentioned this before, but now we're clarifying. We're coming to clarify the text. And so when you bring your animal and it gets sacrificed, some small part of it is burned to God, and the priest keeps some of it, and you get most of the meat back. And then someone came along and said, well, how about the skin? I want the skin too. Can you give me the leather? And they said, no, the priests keep that. The priests keep the skin of the burnt offering. And then likewise, this sort of clarifies what happens with the grain offering. So a grain offering baked in an oven or prepared in a pan or a griddle belongs to the priest who offers it. So if I take some of the flour and I cook it, now that's mine. That belongs to me specifically, the particular priest who cooked it. But the rest, all the other flour that I haven't cooked, that goes to all the sons of Aaron alike. So that is not given to the particular priest who received it. That goes into the common pot. That goes into the storage of the Kohanim to be distributed among all of them. All right. Any questions about this? Thoughts, concerns, clarifications? All right. We will stop here. I want to thank all of you for coming and wish you Shavua Tov. Take care.